Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. I'm a past member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee, and currently I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering questions and connecting you to resources. Disclosing your MS diagnosis to your employer can be a complicated issue that requires careful thought and planning. Christina Forster is joining us today to talk about the risks and benefits of disclosure in the workplace, along with some important things to consider before making the decision to disclose. Christina is a manager of the Benefits, Employment, and Insurance team at the National MS Society and a certified rehabilitation counselor with a background in vocational counseling. Welcome, Christina, and thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
As a complex and unpredictable disease, MS can have varying effects on a person's ability to work. We heard from Annie, and she's wondering if she should be working at all. What advice do you have for Annie and others who are living with MS?
That's a great question, and deciding whether to continue working or not, that's a big deal. And it really is a personal decision, but there are some things to take into consideration. We do encourage individuals to work for as long as they're able to and as long as they want to. And this means being proactive and learning about their legal rights and all the options that are available to them. So it's best for individuals such as Annie to explore all of her options before leaving the workplace or deciding to not work at all. This would include, again, learning about her legal rights, including disclosure and reasonable accommodations, as well as perhaps exploring taking temporary leave to recuperate or changing careers or reducing the amount of hours that she's working or doing a different position at her same place of employment. There really are a lot of options for people to consider. And being that there are so many options for people to consider, we really want people to be aware of them so that they can make an informed decision about their employment situation. A lot of times we see that people make impulsive decisions or they leave prematurely without truly knowing all of their options and understanding potential consequences of leaving their job, such as the financial impact and benefits that are connected to work. And benefits connected to work could include health insurance, short and long-term disability, as well as life insurance. And so if a person leaves their job, they're likely going to lose access to these options. And particularly with health insurance, they're going to want to have a plan for how they're going to handle health insurance. And we know MS is an expensive disease, so it's important to think about the financial impact of leaving a job is as well for Annie and others who may decide to leave the workplace.
Well, once someone decides to remain in the workforce, their next thought is often about disclosure. Do individuals with disabilities have to disclose their diagnosis to their employer?
So the short answer is no, you do not need to disclose. However, if a person does need an accommodation, legally they would need to disclose in order to get that accommodation. And, we see with people, if they're struggling at their job and they need an accommodation, that, we really don't want them to put their job in jeopardy by not disclosing and requesting an accommodation. However, each situation is different, and this is why we encourage individuals to carefully plan and think about their decision on whether to disclose or not. Going through the pros and cons for their unique situation can really help them make that determination. And it's also important to note that once that information is out there, it is out there and you cannot take that back. So it's not something to take lightly for sure. Sometimes a person may be, maybe they're not experiencing symptoms and they don't need an accommodation. So they want to maintain their privacy. So in that situation, they may decide to not disclose, and that's perfectly okay. And we know that MS is unpredictable and varies, so a person's situation can change over time.
Well, Carla tells us that she's decided to disclose her MS to her employer, and she's wondering about how much information she has to share. She wants to know whether she has to provide details about her specific diagnosis, things like that.
Sure, that's a great question. A person with MS can decide initially how much that they want to state. They could say something such as, I have a medical condition, or I have a neurological condition, versus state in the actual diagnosis. However, if the employer needs additional information to determine that it is a disability under the ADA and determine the need for the accommodation, she may ultimately need to provide the actual diagnosis. And I also wanted to mention too, something for Carla and others to keep in mind is that full disclosure eliminates speculation regarding a person's condition. So they may be able to get more support and assistance that way, as well as relief from stress from hiding their condition.
I'm glad you mentioned that because it really starts to answer my very next question. I was going to ask you, what reasons might someone have for wanting to tell their colleagues and others at the job about their diagnosis?
Yeah, sure. There could be a lot of reasons, right? So, even if a person doesn't need an accommodation right now, they may decide that they want to disclose for other reasons. Sometimes people may find that it's stressful and think that they're hiding something. So by not disclosing, and they just want to be honest. And so they decide that they want to disclose, and then that can provide them with some relief. Also, disclosing can open up the lines of communication with their employer. And then, if their situation changes over time and they do need an accommodation at some point, they're already one step ahead because they have those lines of communication open. And it also gives an opportunity to speak freely about your MS, and you can educate your employer about MS if that's something that you're interested in. So there are, many reasons that people might decide to disclose even if they don't need an accommodation right now.
We heard from Destiny, who tells us she was offered a job, but then she was told she had to pass a physical examination. Now, Destiny hasn't told her prospective employer that she has MS. How should she handle this situation?
Yeah, so just to give a little background first, the Americans with Disabilities Act does not prevent employers from obtaining medical and related information that's necessary to evaluate the ability of applicants and employees to perform the essential functions of the job or to promote health and safety to the job. And that being said, it must be consistent with business necessity. And there are different rules for the various stages of employment, such as before making a job offer, making a conditional job offer, and then also after employment has begun. And in Destiny's situation, it sounds like she has been offered the job but has not started working yet. So at this point, employers can require a medical examination because she has been offered the job, as long as all entering employees in the same job category, are subjected to that same exam regardless of disability. And it's always honest, or best to be honest, during these medical examinations. The medical information obtained is kept confidential, The only exception of sharing some information would be if it's discovered that the person would pose a direct threat to health or safety to themselves or to others. But this can be a tricky and confusing situation, so I would encourage individuals who would like more information about medical inquiries to reach out to the MS Society and speak with a member of the Benefits and Employment Support Team, or to visit the Job Accommodation Network's website, which is just askjan.org, or you can give them a call as well.
Let's talk about best practices for a second. Garrett is looking for a new job, and he's wondering if it's a good idea, if it's best for him to disclose his MS during an interview.
Sure. So we get that question a lot, and really, it is a personal decision at the end of the day. But if Garrett does need an accommodation to participate in the interview, he would need to disclose in order to get that accommodation. But I also like to point out, if you don't need an accommodation during the interview, you really want to focus in the interview on your abilities, right? Not your disabilities. So it's just something to keep in mind, to focus more on the abilities, your skills, why you're the best candidate for that job. But ultimately, it is up to the individual on whether to disclose or not.
Now, Maria is applying for a new job, and she's found a question at the end of the application about disabilities. The application states that answering the question is voluntary, but Maria is wondering if it's going to count against her if she doesn't answer the question and later has to disclose her MS to her employer. What would you say about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It sounds like that she's referring to the voluntary self-identification form, which is an invitation to self-identify, but it's not a requirement. And just a little background on that, it's federal contractors are required to ask workers to voluntarily self-disclose whether they have a disability or not, as a way for them to measure their progress toward achieving equal employment for people with disabilities. But again, this is an invitation and it is voluntary. So you do not have to answer the form or disclose your disability. Generally on the form, the options are to mark yes, no, or choose not to answer. And it's best to be honest if you do choose to fill out the form, but I cannot stress enough that it is voluntary. And this form cannot be shared with a person's employer or their coworkers. It is meant to be kept separate from their application, and it will not be held against a person if they do not answer the form and then later need to disclose to their employer and ask for accommodations.
We've heard from Max, and Max has a job, but he's unsure if he should tell his employer about his MS. Max says that he's afraid he might be fired if he discloses his diagnosis. So, what protections do people have when it comes to disclosing disability or chronic illness to their employer?
Sure. Yeah. So first, let me just validate that fear of being fired after disclosing is a very common feeling, and we hear that quite a bit. But there is the Americans with Disabilities Act. When it comes to disclosure and accommodation, it is designed to prevent discriminations. And so employers cannot retaliate if a person does disclose. So if a person loses their job right after disclosing, that's going to look suspicious, and that could be a case of discrimination. And if that person does feel that they've been discriminated against, then they do have the options of talking to an employment law attorney. They could file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC for short, or with their state enforcing agency. Also keep in mind that, a person still does need to be able to do their job with or without accommodations. Again, in this kind of situation, you may want to reach out to the MS Society and talk with a member of the Benefits and Employment Support Team about the decision, first on whether to disclose or not, and going through those pros and cons. And then if they do have a negative experience afterwards and they've lost their job, we can help talk through what the options are for that.
Well, George has decided that he's going to tell his employer about his MS, and he wants to know how to go about it. Does he tell his boss first? Does he tell HR first? And he asks, what about his coworkers? Does everyone need to know?
Yeah, so when deciding who to tell, there are some things that George would want to consider. He'll want to weigh his options and kind of the reasons for disclosing in the first place and the reasons that he's thinking about telling certain people. He doesn't need to tell everybody, but I did want to kind of go through a couple situations to explain, why he may or may not want to tell certain people. So let's say, George needs an accommodation and he's been working there for a while. He has a good relationship with his supervisor and he knows his supervisor is going to be supportive. He might start the conversation with his supervisor. On the other hand, if George is new, he isn't sure his boss will keep the information confidential, or maybe he's even been there for a long time, but doesn't believe his boss would be supportive, then he may choose to go directly to HR first. Um, a person's boss is not required by law to keep this information confidential, so that's just something to keep in mind when deciding who you want to tell. If you need an accommodation and you decide not to go to your supervisor first, because you don't have to, then you could go directly to HR because they're going to be involved at some point if you're asking for an accommodation. And HR managers are trained in the specifics of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they're familiar with accommodations and disclosure. And HR managers are required by law to keep all medical information confidential. Now, when it comes to coworkers, that can be a little trickier. You may have good friends at work and you could tell them about your MS, and that gives you the opportunity to kind of educate them about your symptoms. You may be able to ask them for help at times, and it may relieve some stress. Keep in mind, however, coworkers are not required to keep this information confidential. And some people could react negatively, such as pulling away or not really knowing what to say to their friend anymore. So I think the bottom line is thinking about how many people you want to know about your MS and what the reasons are for disclosing. So if you want to keep it relatively contained, you may just tell HR and possibly your supervisor. When you tell your coworkers, there's really no way of knowing who or how many people they're going to share this information with.
We heard from Troy, and he told us that he's taken more time off lately for doctor's appointments. And he's wondering if the Family Medical Leave Act is considered an accommodation.
Sure, yes. The Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA for short, absolutely can be considered an accommodation. FMLA does allow a person to take unpaid leave for medical reasons, and it does provide job protection, which is really important. Sometimes people do use it in larger chunks if they need to take off for like a month or two, but it can also be used intermittently as an accommodation. So using FMLA as an accommodation for things such as taking off for medical appointments related to chronic impairments such as MS, or to obtain medical treatment such as physical therapy or mental health counseling are a couple of examples of how it could be used. Troy would want to have a conversation with his employer to determine the use of FMLA as an accommodation. And I also did want to mention that for individuals who may not be eligible for FMLA or maybe have exhausted their FMLA, there may be another way that they could request that time off, and that's requesting leave as a reasonable accommodation, which works in the same way that FMLA works.
While we're talking about accommodations, can you share some examples of workplace accommodations that might benefit a person who's living with MS?
Sure. These days there are so many creative ways to accommodate MS symptoms, and even the most complex symptoms such as fatigue and cognitive symptoms. This could include a flexible work schedule, an office closer to the bathroom, longer time to complete tasks, working from home, assistive technology, an ergonomic workstation, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, and to name a few, there's just so many options available. And I would say that it's a good idea for the individual to speak with their healthcare provider for their input, as well as resources such as the MS Society, the Job Accommodation Network, and even talking to a trusted friend or family member for ideas on how to accommodate their symptoms. No two situations, no two jobs, and no two people are alike. So it really comes down to learning about each individual's unique situation and what's going to help them do their job better. And there's great information on our website, including a worksheet to help determine the need and type of accommodation that will work for each individual. And I would encourage individuals to visit our website and take a look at that worksheet for more information.
So once a person has decided to request a workplace accommodation, what's the best way to present that request to their employer?
Yeah, so a person can simply start this by stating to their employer that they need an adjustment or change to their work for a reason related to a medical condition. They don't have to mention the Americans with Disabilities Act or reasonable accommodation. It's okay to use plain English when asking. Um, Once that process is started, it does become an interactive process, and the bulk of the responsibility does fall on the employee. So when I'm working with individuals, I always encourage them to have solutions and backup solutions. Because keep in mind, an employer does not need to give the exact accommodation that a person is requesting. There can be some negotiation during this interactive process, and they can give you a different accommodation than what you ask for as long as it's effective. So, for example, if there are two possible accommodation ideas and one costs more and is more burdensome than the other, the employer can choose the less expensive and less burdensome accommodation as long as it's effective, meaning that it would remove the workplace barrier. And then oftentimes in the process, medical documentation is required to show that the person requesting the accommodation is an individual with a disability under the ADA and to show the need for the accommodation.
Andy wrote in saying that he's anxious about disclosing his MS to people at work because he worries it's going to change their perception of him. Andy wants to know, what are some common reactions that he might expect to receive from his colleagues?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it can be tricky because you don't always know how people are going to respond, right? And as I mentioned earlier, with HR, legally they're required not to say anything to anybody else. With supervisors, we would hope morally that they would not tell others. However, they are not legally bound to keep that information private. But again, focusing on the positives of disclosing to help educate your employer about MS, it can relieve stress. And of course, if you need an accommodation, you would want to disclose for that. And then, there can be the fear about disclosing as well, such as the fear of losing one's job, the fear of being seen differently or being treated differently, and fear of being overlooked for promotions. So in telling coworkers, as we discussed a little earlier, this can be a way, to have additional support, but we also don't know how people are going to react, and they could not understand maybe and then pull away a little bit. And this goes back to what was said in the very beginning. You really want to carefully consider the pros and cons of disclosing and who you're disclosing to and the reason behind why you want to disclose. Of course, I've said it many times, but legally, if you need an accommodation, you do need to disclose. If you do not need an accommodation right now, then definitely carefully thinking through the pros and cons of your unique situation to help you decide whether or not to tell anybody at work. And we do have a worksheet on our website that can help with going through those pros and cons.
Well, you've shared some great information about disclosing MS in the workplace. What would you say are the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our viewers to remember?
Top 3 takeaways. I would say for one is to learn about your rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act and understand the relationship between disclosure and accommodations, because knowledge really is power. And then I would also say to think about your unique situation and ask yourself why you're considering whether to disclose or not, and list out those pros and cons for your situation so that you can determine a plan of action. And the third one, part of what that plan of action could be is writing a disclosure script and then planning your approach to speak with your employer. And that worksheet that I was talking about that goes over the pros and cons also has information about helping you come up with a disclosure script, which can be found on our website.
Well, thank you for sharing your expertise with us, Christina. I think we have time for one more question. We heard from Sam, who tells us that he's heard that vocational rehabilitation can help with some of the challenges he's facing at work. And Sam wants to know whether a vocational rehabilitation counselor is going to be able to help him deal with the invisible symptoms of MS, like cognitive dysfunction or fatigue.
Yeah, so vocational rehabilitation is a resource that can help individuals who are struggling and maintaining their job. And the services could include assessing one's symptoms, and if there are solutions that can help with that. So for example, if somebody's having mobility issues and considering getting a scooter or wheelchair, the Vocational Rehabilitation Agency may be able to assist also not just assessing the symptoms, but with obtaining the equipment. I will say, though, that vocational rehabilitation can take some time to become eligible for. You have to apply for their services, and then it takes time to determine their eligibility. So they are a great resource and can provide that assistance. I would also just say to remember, you can also reach out to the MS Society and the Job Accommodation Network for assistance with brainstorming accommodation ideas and solutions.
Well, thanks to everyone who submitted questions, and thank you for being with us today, Christina.
Thank you so much.
Before we close, I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please be sure to visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups. You'll learn about ways that you can get involved, and you'll hear about upcoming events that are taking place near you. Remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that we start here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Christina for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webcast will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webcast is important. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to a survey pinned to the comments section. And on YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Christina Forster and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us.